Dominic Cummings, heading into number 10 this morning, was asked whether he'd made a second trip to Durham, as alleged in newspapers overnight.
Did you return to Durham in April? Lots of people wanting to know this morning. Did you return?
No, I did not.
You didn't return?
Two leaders.
Yesterday saw a wave of supportive Twitters from top cabinet ministers saying Dominic Cummings had done nothing wrong when he drove from London to Durham with his wife and child the moment he heard his wife had COVID-19.
Why did you not stay on your primary residence, Mr Cummings, as the government guidelines state? Why did you go 260 miles across the country?
Some opinion polls suggested growing public hostility to his actions.
Do you have anything to add for people who have been self-isolating across this country, who have seen that you've travelled miles across it? I think that's a no.
Some Tories said opinion amongst MPs from the cabinet down was turning against Dominic Cummings.
I've heard phrases this morning of he's run out of rope, the ice has cracked beneath his feet, he's run out of goodwill, he's run out of diesel. There's a whole variety of phrases that are being used.
I'm quite certain that there are a significant number of my colleagues who will feel as I do. This has gone on too long. Time has come for Mr Cummings to go.
Not long after being seen darting out of the door of number 10, Dominic Cummings and his wife and child drove to Durham, where his parents live, instead of self-isolating at their London home, as government advice clearly stated they should. The Mirror and the Observer alleged overnight that he'd been seen 2 weeks later, 30 miles from Durham, at Barnard Castle. The papers also alleged that Dominic Cummings had gone back to Durham later last month after a trip to London. Number 10 denied the last of these, but that left other allegations hanging, and tonight the Prime Minister used the Number 10 press conference to try to bat them away.
I want to begin by answering the big question that people have been asking in the last 48 hours, and that is this government asking you, the people, the public, to do one thing, while senior people here in government do something else? Today, I've had extensive face-to-face conversations with Dominic Cummings, and I've concluded that in travelling to find the right kind of childcare, at the moment when both he and his wife were about to be incapacitated by coronavirus, and when he had no alternative, I think he followed the instincts of every father and every parent, and I do not mark him down for that. And though there have been many other allegations about what happened when he was in self-isolation and thereafter, some of them palpably false, I believe that in every respect he has acted responsibly and legally and with integrity.
I'm a bit puzzled. You've had this long chat with Dominic Cummings. You said he went where he could get childcare. I thought he's now saying he didn't receive any childcare, but did all the childcare himself. You say he drove up the road when he was about to be incapacitated. He didn't know that. He couldn't know that. Could he? And you say, more alarmingly really, you say he was following instincts. The rest of the country was following rules, not instincts. Are we now all entitled to follow instincts? Where will that leave it when a tracer goes round to someone and says, well, you have COVID, I need you to isolate?
Well, Gary, as I've said just now, the guidance makes it very clear that where you have particular childcare needs, that has got to be taken into account. And as I've said, I've looked very clear. I've seen a lot of stuff in the last few days about this episode of self-isolation by Mr. Cummings that does not seem to correspond remotely with reality. And as far as I can see, he stuck to the rules and he acted legally and responsibly, and with the sole objective of avoiding such contact as would spread the virus.
He got the virus probably in the train, in the car, didn't he?
Well, his objective was to stop the spread of the virus, and he behaved in such a way as to do that.
The Prime Minister rushed forward an announcement originally expected next week. But he hopes primary schools will start opening for some years after the Whitsun break.
Thank you.
But he knows the easing of lockdown leaves many instructions and rules in place, and confusion or a collapse in compliance could cost lives.
Well, Gary joins me now from the newsroom. Gary, your further thoughts?
Well, we've had reaction from the Labour leader to this. Keir Starmer said he thought that what the government is doing insults the sacrifices of the British people. Labour ratcheting up its offensive on Dominic Cummings there. But I think what's even more interesting in a way immediately is the Tory reaction. I won't be the only journalist whose phone's been pinging with reaction from ministers, cabinet ministers, backbenchers. One of them called that press conference Trumpian. Another one said most decent British grandparents now feel betrayed. The government desperately wanted and feels it won the mantle of being with the many, not the few, the people's government as it proclaimed itself. And I think Labour now sees an opening here, and Tories, some of them are worried that this is a cut-through issue, not a bubble issue, and it will potentially deliver the beginnings of some support to Labour, which they otherwise wouldn't have. The government's calculation must be that another news cycle comes along, other announcements come along, this will drift off the news agenda. The problem is, there is only really one news agenda at the moment. Everything is a variation on the theme about COVID, and that makes it much, much harder to get rid of this story than it normally is.
Gary, thanks very much. Well, the government has denied claims that Dominic Cummings made 2 trips to Durham. Transport Secretary Grant Shapps insisted Mr Cummings stayed put after his initial 270-mile drive there. But once there, did he strictly observe lockdown rules? One eyewitness accused him of driving to Barnard Castle, some 30 miles from Durham, in order to exercise, a claim that has angered some locals. From Barnard Castle, here's our senior Home Affairs correspondent, Simon Israel.
This is where evidence began to emerge in the shadows of a 900-year-old castle, which gives its name to a market town 250 miles from London. There was a day trip by Dominic Cummings' family. He was recognised by one of the town's residents who took it upon himself to investigate further. This is where the government's chief advisor was, according to an eyewitness, seen out walking with his wife and child. Retired teacher Robin Lees wouldn't do an interview on camera, but told Channel 4 News he was adamant that the person he saw was Dominic Cummings. And his partial reading of a number plate of a car parked near here was later matched to a car photographed in Downing Street. The alleged trip was on the day following 2 weeks of self-isolation after both Mr Cummings and his wife contracted the virus. But the perception in this town mirrors that of hundreds of emails from angry constituents to Tory MPs right across the country.
Why isn't he answering the people of Barnard Castle? Was he here on a jolly for his wife's birthday? I'd like to know. Now, I had a granddaughter born during lockdown. I was supposed to be there when she was born. I haven't even held her. We've all got family, Mr Cummings. Yours are no more important than mine.
They're telling you to do one thing and they're doing the wrong thing. Boris should sack him.
It's a long way to travel, 250 miles, when he thought he had the touch of the virus.
No one I spoke to here offered any word of support for Mr Cummings, with no acceptance of the nuances as to why he came to his parents in County Durham in the first place. And there still remains questions over what exactly he did while he was here. Another sighting in Durham itself, a week after the visit to Barnard Castle, has been denied by Downing Street. That person has told Channel 4 News that while he can't swear to it, he believes he saw the advisor whilst out running that day. Simon Israel, Channel 4 News, Barnard Castle.
Well, I'm joined now by the Conservative MP Peter Bone, who earlier today called for Dominic Cummings' resignation. Mr Bone, what did you make of the Prime Minister's really very vigorous defence of his chief aide?
Well, the Prime Minister has looked into it in great detail and clearly knows more about the ins and outs of it than I do. But my constituents and myself think, look, that was a clear breach of the guidelines. And I know constituents, I know a particular family who had 2 young children. One of the parents went down with COVID. They didn't up sticks and go to be somewhere near their parents for child care reasons because the rules didn't let them do that. And he broke the rules.
Well, he denies that. But, I mean, you heard in Simon's piece, though, the grandmother who hasn't even been able to hold her new granddaughter born during the pandemic. Boris Johnson is insistent that it's not one rule for the people and your constituents and another rule for the people in power. What do you think, though?
I certainly know my constituents in Wellingborough have adhered to the rules and they've done remarkably well and they made great sacrifices. I mean, the real issue here is I think Dominic Cummings should have resigned. He should not have put the Prime Minister in a position of keeping him on or sacking him. When the advisor becomes the story, the advisor should resign. Now, Boris is quite entitled to have whoever he wants as advisor, but he shouldn't have been put in that position. So if Dominic Cummings should have done the right thing and resigned, and unfortunately he hasn't.
How widely is that view shared amongst backbenchers who you've been in touch with today?
I think it's a very strong opinion among backbenchers, and it is surprising that whether you're on the, I don't know, the Leave side of the argument like me, a strong Leaver, or the Remain side of the argument like Lord Heseltine, we both agree that this is someone who should have resigned. And
what about this idea that he was following the instincts of every father? Do you have any sympathy with that?
Well, it may well be the instincts of that family I spoke to. Probably their instincts was to go and see the children's grandparents for protection. But they didn't follow their instincts, they obeyed the law. And you've got to remember, this happened when it was the most strict lockdown, where you hardly went out for a walk except for exercise. People are dancing on a pin, and head of a pin when they pretend that this was not a breach of the rules. Now, he could have apologised. He could have said, I made a mistake. I did it because I thought it was the right thing to do at the time. And we could have moved on.
Why?
Unfortunately, he hasn't done that.
OK, so why are people in power dancing on the head of a pin on this? Is he just too important to sack, do you think?
He's definitely not too important to sack. This government doesn't need Dominic Cummings to continue to be a good government. My fear is that with him carrying on in power, he will damage the government and Boris's government will be weaker because of it rather than stronger. But again, I go back to my point. It shouldn't have been up to Boris to sack him or keep him on. He should have resigned. He should have realised he'd done something wrong, been found out, and resigned.
You've said you fear this will damage the government and weaken the Prime Minister. How hard will it be, do you think, to persuade people now to follow the lockdown rules and carrying on with that?
Well, I know my constituents, and I think up and down the people follow the advice they're given, and they want to do the right thing. And we're moving to a different phase now, and we're moving to more outside contact. We're going to more common sense, and I hope the economy grows. But that's different. We're not talking about now when this happened. We were talking about when the strict lockdown rules applied. I mean, Boris's government will continue, and it will be successful, and we will be a good government. But it'll be weaker because of Mr. Cummings being there rather than stronger.